Doctors care about a lot of things. In our society, they care about running their machines and doing procedures and helping people, not to knock all doctors. This guy really, he's not after the money, he's after the truth, and he's arming people with the truth. Not all doctors like that, but I sure as heck appreciate it. John McDougall, thank you.
I've had a chance to know Jeff and Sabrina and their mom and dad and family for a long time. And it's a lot of fun. I talk about myself being the luckiest doctor in the world. And I do feel that way. I'm the luckiest doctor in the world because my patients get well. Whereas when I used to practice the other way, they didn't get well. Go to the slide, please. This is one of my patients, and this is 2 years before I met him. And he's a very rich man, lives in the Santa Rosa area, can control everything. He's got plenty of money to go see all the doctors he wants to go see. And this is a picture of him 2 years before I met him. And he had high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, hypertriglyceridemia, gout, mild kidney failure, overweight, mild osteoarthritis, constipated, and depressed. And he went to the doctor faithfully for 2 years, took all the medications, did everything that the doctors recommended for him, and here's a picture of him 2 years later. Okay, 2 years later, he's got hypertension, type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, hypertriglyceridemia, gout, mild kidney failure, overweight. Okay, my question is what changed in 2 years? The shirt. You know, this is what medical care is all about. If you can stop and think about your mother, your father, your friend, somebody you work with, somebody you know well, who with the best intentions went to their physician, and with their physician's best intentions were treated. And the results are they're still fat, sick people. They're just carrying around a bag full of drugs now. This is a generalization that includes essentially everybody. I have never seen anybody get healthier with this kind of care. I've been in medicine for 41 years. For 41 years, I've waited for a patient to get well by this kind of therapy. I've never seen it when it comes to chronic disease. And the reason I don't practice this way anymore, I do use drugs. I have a prescription pad. I'm licensed in 4 states to practice. But the reason drugs are the last thing that I do is because the results are so minimal in most cases. The real benefits come from changing diet and lifestyle. I've heard some stories here that are absolutely amazing. If any doctor had patients with the stories that I've heard just in the couple hours that I've been here, they would be so happy practicing medicine. They'd be so fulfilled. But you just don't do that. That's why your physicians are unhappy, because the tools given to them are ineffective and harmful and costly. But they're profitable, so it continues. All right, let's see what we can get through today. I have a few more of those dollars, by the way, left. What can I say? I brought $53. I gave 43 out. That means 43 people understood what I had to say. So I'll have to come back. All right, one of the things that I gave you during the last presentation is I gave you an opportunity to enjoy starches. Starches are comfort food. You love starch. I mean, I was raised in the Midwest on potatoes. When I moved to Hawaii, it was rice. People love starch, but they fear starch. Of course, you understand now unnecessarily. The other thing that they love is salt. Yeah. Salt is the scapegoat of the Western diet. A scapegoat. The derivation of the word scapegoat is from a Jewish history. It's an old ceremony that used to be done in the old biblical days, where what they would do in a village is they'd take a goat and they'd lay the sins of the village on the goat and send it out into the desert to die. That's where the name scapegoat comes from. Well, salt is the scapegoat of the Western diet. Doctors know 5 things. 5 things doctors know. There were 2 things I learned in medical school. And I went to medical school between 1968 and 1972. The 2 things I knew were don't recommend butter, instead recommend margarine. And of course, we know that that's completely false and very dangerous to recommend margarine, because margarine is trans fat, and there are actually some cities like New York City and some states like California that are outlawing the sale of trans fats in restaurants. So that was wrong. The second thing I knew, and I'd be very honest with you, this is all I knew as a young doctor, was to put patients on a low-salt diet. It turns out that's wrong too, and I'll explain that to you in just a couple of minutes. The third thing doctors know today is they know that when women come in and ask whether or not they should eat soy, women are told, you should eat soy, it prevents breast cancer. But if you have breast cancer, don't eat soy because it promotes breast cancer. Oh, you've heard this. This is the truth. Of course, neither one are really of any value. Soy does little to prevent, and as far as I know, does nothing to promote breast cancer. But it's something doctors can tell patients. They're nutritional experts. And then the fourth thing doctors know is very popular today. How many of you have had your vitamin D level checked? Yeah, pretty good. Maybe at least a third of the people in this room. How many of you passed the test? 3 or 4 of you. Okay, this is another very popular thing, nutritional thing doctors do, is they check for vitamin D levels. Now, instead of telling patients to fix the problem by correcting the cause, which is inadequate sunshine, what they do is they put them on a pill. And the fact that 9 out of 10 people flunk the test tells me there's something wrong here. A whole lecture on vitamin D that I won't be giving you today. And then, of course, the fifth thing that doctors know are starches are fattening. All right, salt. Let's talk about salt. It has a great history to it. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. That's where the word salary comes from. It was so valuable, it was so rare, that it was actually a way of rewarding people for their work. Greek slaves were often bartered for salt, giving rise to the expression, not worth his salt. Covenants in both the Old and New Testament were often sealed with salt, and that's the origin of the word salvation. Jesus called his disciples the salt of the earth. Sitting above the salt refers to a place of aristocracy, above the common folks, and the French word for hello is salute, from the word salt. Now, people eat divergent levels of salt, great ranges of salt intake. There's the Yamanano Indian that lives in Colombia and also in Brazil. They live in the basins of the Amazon, and they consume about 200 to 250 milligrams of sodium a day. The least amount of sodium that's determined by experimentation that people can live on and still be healthy is 50 milligrams. But you'd have to synthesize the diet to get it as low as 50 milligrams. Naturally, a diet will contain about 200, 250 milligrams. So these people in Brazil and Colombia live on about 200 milligrams a day. In 1959, Korean soldiers included in their diet 30,000 milligrams of salt, which is about 1,200 milligrams of sodium. And people in northern Japan, they consumed a lot of salt too. That's 27 grams of salt, which is about 10,000 milligrams of sodium. And the average American consumes, they say, about 3,500 milligrams of sodium, maybe 5,500 milligrams, somewhere in that range of sodium intake. So you see there's a great range of salt intakes that people have consumed. Larry and Ann were on this trip with us. Remember this trip? We went to the San Blas Islands. San Blas Islands are off the coast of Panama on the east side, the Caribbean side, and they're about this high above the ocean. So if you're going to visit them, you need to go soon, because they're going to be underwater very shortly, and I don't joke. But they have a distinct form of art, and we went to see them probably about 12, 15 years ago. And these folks who live on this island eat a very high salt diet, but they don't have any high blood pressure or heart disease. Yet when they move to Panama City and they change their diet and eat less sodium, they get sick with high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, and so on. Why? Because they change to the urban diet. And you can see this around the world, various populations of people who are near vegetarian. Regardless of their salt intake, they're healthy people. But when they leave their native plant-based, starch-based meal plan and move to the cities and switch to all the animal foods, they consistently get sick. So, go back to the basic anatomy. You're designed as a salt seeker. Do you think this was a mistake? This urge, this desire of yours is there to keep you alive because you need minerals. What industry has done is they've taken our basic drives, salt and sugar. Those are the only two pleasurable senses on the tip of our tongue. They've taken salt and sugar and they've turned it into a way of selling more and more food, junk food in this case, to people. So what used to be a rare commodity, used to be the celery for Roman soldiers, used to be a very valuable commodity, is on every table in a column and a shaker. And the same thing with sugar. They put sugar in everything from infant formula to geriatric formula. So they take advantage of our natural senses and as a result cause some serious problems. But you are designed as a salt seeker. That's not a mistake. You're designed as a carbohydrate seeker in the form of starch primarily. That's your basic design. Mine too. The reason we have this wide variance in salt intake, the reason we can do this is because of our metabolic makeup. In particular, because of this organ, which is the kidney. The kidney can eliminate virtually all the salt that you can eat. So the dying of salt excess, I've never really heard of it. It may be possible. I mean, there may be some cases. I don't know. I've never seen a case. What happens is when you eat a lot of salt, the kidney just excretes the salt into the urine. I remember when I was in college, when I worked in a Ford stamping plant in the summertime, we used to have to take salt tablets because they were worried about us becoming salt deprived from the sweating. But that would have never been a problem because my kidneys actively and correctly balance the salt in my body and always would and always will. If I wouldn't take any salt in it and say I was on a very low salt diet, the kidneys would work in the opposite direction and they'd conserve the sodium. And likewise in the skin, what would happen is the sweat would be very low salt. So you have very effective organs at dealing with the mineral and the salt balance. How effective? Well, you can take a look at Ironman triathlon runners who compete for 12 hours with no added salt to their diet. They have no problems at all. Out in the scorching heat. They're easily and effectively preserve their mineral balance. Let's take a look at some of the basic research, and I think this is going to disturb you at the least, and see what science says about salt intake and disease. Now, I'm not cherry-picking the literature on you. You can go over all the literature. I have a good friend named George Guthrie. He's actually writing a paper on this, and he has looked at essentially all of the literature on sodium intake and health and put it together in a paper he's trying to get published now, and it says essentially what I'm going to tell you right now. This is the Enns-Haynes study representing nearly 100 million U.S. people. And what they do is they look at the salt intake versus problems like death and heart disease. And what they conclude, they say, there is a robust, significant, consistent, significant inverse association between dietary sodium and cardiovascular mortality. That means strokes and heart attacks. That means the more salt you eat, the less strokes and heart attacks. Now you take a look at another publication of the same study that was published last year in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. Observed associations of lower sodium with higher mortality were modest and mostly not statistically significant. However, these findings also suggest that for the general U.S. adult population, the higher sodium is unlikely to be independently associated with higher cardiovascular or all-cause mortality. Those are two reports on the biggest nutritional studies in the U.S. Let's take a look at worldwide data and reports on salt intake. This is from actually something called the SALT study from the British Medical Journal. Lower sodium intake may have adverse effects on the vascular endothelium through stimulation of the renin-angiotensin system, that's the adrenal system, and on serum total and low-density lipoprotein cholesterol concentrations. In cohort studies, lower salt intake in people with hypertension has been associated with higher levels of cardiovascular disease and in general populations with greater all-cause mortality. In other words, the science says something opposite of what you and I have been told. The reason salt is associated with more disease is because of the company it keeps. That's the problem. It's not the salt, it's the company it keeps, the way the salt is delivered to us, and that's in these foods. Salt serves as a marker for eating salami and bacon and cheese. Now, when I was growing up, salt is very important. Now, what I want to bring you back to is what I'm giving you here. I gave you the last hour a chance to eat starch, which you love. Now I'm giving you a chance to make it even tastier. Okay? I'm removing all excuses for you and everybody you know from eating a healthy diet. When I was a kid growing up in Michigan, we used to have, as my father became wealthier, we used to have steaks on the grill outside 3 times a week. And my dad taught me how to make a good steak. The way you do it is you get yourself a slab of cow muscle about an inch and a half thick, and you put it on the grill and you burn it on one side, you turn it over, and on the burnt side you put about a half a box of salt on it. And you let the salt simmer in the juices. And you turn it over again. After you've burned that side, you put the other half a box of salt on it. That's how you make a good steak. And it really is. I mean, how many people do you know that would eat boiled beef? Or boiled chicken? The only way you can get that stuff down is by adulterating it with heavy doses of something that you innately like, which is salt. They do that with other kinds of foods, for example, dairy. One of my toughest jobs as an internal medicine resident, which was between 1976 and 1978, when I was on the kidney ward, what I was asked to do was to go to the patients on dialysis and tell them they had to eat saltless butter and saltless cheese. And they would try it, and they'd say, "Doc, I can't eat that. That just tastes like a glob of grease." The only way you can get the butter and the cheese into people is to load it with heavy doses of salt. It's so disgusting. So 80% of the salt that people eat is what we call non-discretionary. In other words, you don't have a choice. It's not what you add at the table. It's mixed up in the food. And look at some of the foods that we consume that are high in sodium. Typical foods. American cheese, 404 milligrams per 100 calories. Cottage cheese, 560. Salami, 510. So if you're going to eat a typical diet, say 2,000 calories a day, non-discretionary salt intake, no choice you have, you take in 10,000 milligrams of sodium a day. And if you're going to consume 3,000 calories, you take in 15,000 milligrams of sodium a day. And to repeat, what that sodium is acting is as a marker for all of the harmful foods that you've eaten. All right, so why is it that people teach you low salt? Why is the message low salt? The message is low salt because you can't do it. In other words, you can't eat a low-salt diet. It's a very difficult thing for patients to do, to eat a low-salt. Oh, they might be able to do it for a week or 2 weeks to be real careful about the salt intake. But after that, they just give it up because it's too hard to do, because we're designed as seekers and consumers of these minerals. Second of all, if you do it, you look back at your efforts and you say, nothing happened. Nothing happened. So why should you do it? So why does somebody put their whole effort, why does a country, a health system, put its whole effort into telling you to do something that you can't do and that doesn't work? Because it results in no change. No change in the number of sick people. No change in the diet of Americans. No change in the sale of drugs. No change in the business of hospitals. Everything stays the same, and that's what they want. The status quo is to keep everything the same. Now, what if we had an administration? What if we had a Surgeon General like Regina Benjamin? Well, I have some work to do on her yet. But what if we had a Surgeon General? She's not Surgeon General yet either. I'm still up for the job. What if we had a Surgeon General or a president like our President Obama and doctors around the country who said, let's deal with the problem. Let's deal with the problem. Let's deal with the thing that's making people sick, and that is to tell them to stop eating meat and dairy. What would happen? Big change would happen. Somebody was sitting there at the lunch table with me a minute ago. But what if we did this? Think of all the people that would go out of work. Yeah, a lot of people would go out of work, like doctors and hospitals and morticians. And I mean, we'd have a big change. But that's the message that would make a difference. But we don't teach that because those in power don't want a difference. All right, salt is associated with some diseases like high blood pressure, stroke, heart disease, osteoporosis, edema, heart failure, kidney disease, and stomach cancer. A little. Let's take a look at what we call a meta-analysis of the randomized trials on salt reduction and its effect on blood pressure. Again, I'm not cherry-picking the literature for you. You can go look it up for yourself. This is what it says. Looking at randomized trials, and this is a big study on this, they lowered sodium intake by 1,725 milligrams. That's about a teaspoon, almost a teaspoon of salt, to 2,300 milligrams a day, and the result was it lowered the top number, systolic, by 1 to 5 millimeters of mercury, and it lowered the bottom number by 0.6 to 3 millimeters of mercury. Big deal. I mean, in our program, in 7 days, I stopped the blood pressure pills on almost every patient. And yet our reduction in blood pressure is an average, same levels they're looking at, is an average of 15 over 13 millimeters of mercury. Why? Because we introduced a big change. We put them on a starch-based diet and eliminated the disease-causing foods, the meat and the dairy products. So when it comes to high blood pressure, little benefits realized when you follow the advice given. Sodium and kidney stones, I'll tell you what it is. When I go to these conferences that are I used to, I don't anymore, but the ones that were sponsored by the dairy industry, they would try and take the focus off the problem, which is the animal protein, very acidic protein damaging the bones. And they start giving lectures on sodium intake. See, if they can just take you off the mark a little bit. The effect of sodium on calcium balance is minor, to say the least. It's there. You can show it. But if you could just take the audience's attention a little bit away from what really is the problem, which is the cheese. Yeah, the cheese is the most acidic food people eat. And you can have them worry about the sodium. Then you've accomplished your goal. Same thing with stomach cancer. The old literature on salt and stomach cancer suggests there's a relationship between eating high salt diets, but the new stuff, I mean, the really big current studies show that it's the meat that people eat. When I have people, if you come to our clinic, our diet is serve very low sodium. I'll talk to you about that in just a minute. But the reason I have it very low in sodium is we do get people with severe heart failure who really have to be on a low-salt diet. We occasionally get people with kidney diseases that require them to be on a low-salt diet, or people with really severe edema. So no question, these people have to be on a restricted salt diet. But this is a small number of people who have been severely damaged. The effect of diet really has to do with a lot more than just salt. It has to do with all the ingredients of the food, all the different effects. For example, chloride has a more profound effect on blood pressure than does sodium. If you lower the chloride in the diet of, we don't talk about experimental animals here, but if we did, if you lowered the chloride, but after all, we're not doing anything bad except making them have lower blood pressure, right? So that's okay. If you lowered the chloride intake, you'd find it had a much more profound effect on the blood pressure than would lowering the sodium intake. And if you raise the potassium level, and by the way, a vegetable diet is very high in potassium. The American diet's 1,000 milligrams. Our diet's about 5,000 milligrams. If you raise the potassium, much more effective lowering of blood pressure, improving health than does lowering the sodium. So there are all kinds of ingredients in these plant foods that have this effect, all in the same direction of making the blood vessels healthier, the blood pressure go down, the tissues healthier, and so on. It's not the isolated ingredients. It's the whole food that makes a difference. These look good. We're back to potatoes again. You think I rigged this, don't you? I did not. Back to potatoes again. I love potatoes, and if I could have a little salt on my potatoes, I'd be just fine. There are all kinds of salts. If you come to our clinic, I don't know what Mary's serving these days, but it's some kind of exotic salt she has on the table, not just plain old Morton's iodized salt, something really exotic she has on there. But you can buy all kinds of salt, like black salt, Celtic salt, coarse salt, flake, all kinds of Hawaiian sea salt. It's all salt. Now, it may make your food taste a little bit different by trying some of these exotic salts, but the effect on your health is virtually the same. You may want to do this, so you may want to experiment with some different kinds of salts to get different tastes, because they all have a little bit different mineral content, which is tasted differently. I want to talk to you about one of my heroes. I have a lot of heroes. I have a lot of people whose shoulders I stand on. There's very little that I do that's original, to be quite honest with you. You've probably heard me talk of some of my heroes like Roy Swank, who did the studies on multiple sclerosis when he was at the University of Oregon. 50 years of research showing you can stop multiple sclerosis with a healthy diet. He's one of my mentors, one of my heroes. As a matter of fact, so much so that I raised $1 million. And right now, we are doing a study at the Oregon Health Science University with their neurology department on treating multiple sclerosis with our diet. Yeah, so... So he was one of my mentors. Roy Swank was. Nathan Pritikin, guy from right around this area. Most of you know about him. He was one of my mentors, taught me so much. There are a few others that I could talk about, Russell Henry Chittenden, and many people who, by the way, all taught a starch-based diet. Walter Kempner, one of my mentors. In fact, the only doctor I learned about in medical school was Walter Kempner, who taught diet and health. Okay, the only physician that was ever mentioned in 4 years of medical school connecting diet and health was Walter Kempner. And you may have heard about Walter Kempner and his work because it's quite famous. He invented and popularized the rice diet. The rice diet is a starch-based diet. He came from Germany in 1939, moved to Durham, North Carolina, to Duke University, and started teaching the rice diet, which is a diet of rice and fruits and a few vegetables, and then later on, maybe if you were good or bad, I don't know, later on maybe give you a little bit of meat. He showed and published and lectured to doctors all over the world before 1953. I mean, published in our best medical journals. He showed that you could take people with high blood pressure, not the wimpy stuff you guys have. I'm talking about real high blood pressure, like 240 over 160. Okay? The stuff you guys have is, just fodder for the drug industry. But he would take people with really high blood pressure and he would make them normotensive 60% of the time by feeding them a diet of rice and fruits and later on some vegetables. He would take people with heart failure so bad when you took the chest x-ray, the heart filled the entire chest cavity and shrink the heart down to normal size on the rice diet. He'd take people with abnormal electrocardiograms, and in half the cases he would reverse them to normal cardiograms. He showed before 1953 and published in the scientific literature that you could take people with diabetic retinopathy, this means hemorrhages and exudates in their eyes, and you could reverse it with the rice diet. Yeah. Anyway, I went to visit the Kempner, the Rice House. It's called the Rice House in Durham, North Carolina. I went there when my son was in college at Chapel Hill. Oh, this was probably about 7, 8 years ago. And I visited with the folks, and Walter Kempner had already died by then. This is one of my regrets in life, is I never met this person who gave me so much as far as my foundation goes. And I went to his clinic and I talked to the doctors that work there still, and the Rice Clinic is still open. They're still seeing people, and it's a great place to get well if you like rice and fruit. And we talked about all the different things that they accomplished at their clinic and the stuff that we accomplished. It was virtually one-to-one, same thing. And we started talking about rheumatoid arthritis. And I started telling these doctors about how our patients with rheumatoid arthritis, their arthritis disappeared and they were essentially cured. And they came back and they said, well, the same thing's been happening with us for as long as Kempner's been here, which is 1939. And what Dr. Walter Kempner said is because the salt gets out of the joints, and as a result, the inflammation goes away. And I said, well, that's not exactly how I understand it happening, but who cares? Really, who cares what the mechanism is? The important thing is it does work. If you feed people a starch-based diet with fruits and vegetables, their rheumatoid arthritis goes away. Well, Walter Kempner basically taught and published everything that I know when I was like 6 years old. And Roy Swank, in 1952, published basically everything I know when I was just a young child. And so did many of my other mentors. Russell Henry Chitton had published basically everything I know in 1905. Many great men, it happens to be men, wasn't my choice, but many great men have laid the foundation for all of this in excellent scientific research and studies. But there's one thing that I have that they didn't have. They knew everything I know. They were very famous people, but I hold one card, and I know these people either personally or I know their histories. I hold one card that none of them ever had, and that card is Mary, yeah. Absolutely. Because Mary's taken what all of us know to be the truth, and she's made it practical and work. Yeah, she did. Now, those DVDs we have out there, I'm not trying to sell them to you, but the DVDs are actually shot, 3-camera shots, professionally shot in our kitchen with Mary cooking. And you'll see what the real difference is. And those of you who know Mary, you know that I don't exaggerate in the slightest. She made it so that we could do it. All right, so let's see. If you come to my clinic in Santa Rosa, or if you follow the McDougall program out of the books, you'll be eating a diet that contains about 500 milligrams of sodium, as long as you're careful not to eat the soy sauce. Soy sauce is, of course, full of salt. And then you'll find on the table a salt shaker. As I mentioned, it probably has some exotic salt in it, because Mary's kind of into exotic salts right now. But you'll find a salt shaker on the table, and you go, oh my goodness, they put that on there by mistake. That was not a mistake. The salt shaker is there on purpose. And if I see you, because I see all the patients still myself, if I see you and tell you have to be on a low-salt diet and you can't touch that salt shaker, then you can't. But if I don't mention it, you can touch the salt shaker. And say you decide to use the salt shaker. Say you add a half a teaspoon of salt to your diet every day. You just added 1,100 milligrams of sodium to your diet. You started with 500, you added 1,100, now you're up to 1,600 milligrams of sodium you're taking in on our diet by adding a half a teaspoon of salt to the food. If you have a massive heart attack, end up in the intensive care unit of your local hospital here, their low sodium diet is 2,000 milligrams of sodium, which is 400 more than ours with a half a teaspoon of salt added. So, you know me, those of you who know me, you know how I always try and be politically correct. Socially acceptable, not ruffle any feathers. So what I do is I recommend you do this. You make the basic foods. You don't put any salt in them when you're making them because the salt you put in is going to get mixed up and you're not going to taste it. And let's assume eating more salt is not good for you. Certainly that's the safe way to believe. Then when you get done making all the food, you put the salt on the surface of the food so you can taste it. The tip of the tongue tastes it. And then you've covered all bases and all concerns by adding the salt to the surface of the food. We have a product, it's called Dr. McDougall's Rights Foods. It's served in at least 4,000 markets across the country. This is very tasty. I'm sure many of you have had it. It's the best tasting prepared packaged food on the market. And I say that without any hesitation. But it has salt in it. Why does it have salt in it? Why does it have salt in it? Why? That's right. No salt, no sale. Nobody'd buy it. So we put salt in the food. It's in a separate seasoning package, so you can put as much in as you want. You can make it lower sodium by just adding less of the seasoning where the salt is. But still, we've gotten criticism. Now, when the ramen noodles, you compare that, you're taking in about 1,400 milligrams per 100 calories. So ours is really relatively quite low in salt. But I'll tell you what we did just to appease people. Again, you know how socially and politically correct I am, is we made a low sodium variety, put light sodium on there, sells like mad. Look how much salt it has in it. 175 to 300 milligrams per 100 calories. Very similar to that, but it's got the right label on it, so everything's okay. Okay? This is what I want you to understand. It's not the salt. It's not the salt that's the problem. If you continue to believe it is, then you're not going to solve your problems. It's the bacon that's the problem. And once you get that figured out, you can use a little bit of salt on your starch-based meal plan, and it satisfies those two important taste buds on the tip of your tongue. And it's something not only can you do for a lifetime, but you will prefer to do for a lifetime. Those of you who have discovered this, the enjoyment of a starch-based meal plan with a little added spice and salt, you look around at other people, you go, I really feel sorry. Look at them. They don't understand this. You walk into a restaurant, you see all these fat people gobbling up with this disgusting food, and you feel sorry for them. I'm sure many of you have come to this same understanding. What we know is so enjoyable, so powerful. We've got to spread the word. When I told you last hour, after you leave this conference, when you meet people, and they say things contrary to what you know to be the truth, just don't walk away. Just don't say, well, that's too bad to yourself. Don't do that. Confront them. Tell them the truth. They may not listen the first time. They may not listen the second time. But sooner or later, just like with you and I, we'll learn the truth, and we'll see it, and then changes will take place. And we can have a better world. But it's going to take an army of people standing up and causing a revolution to make it happen. We can do that. We have to do it. We really have no choice.